Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of ForbesWomen. According to a new piece of concerning research, women's representation in corporate leadership is remaining stagnant on a global level. And there are also concerning degrees of disclosure about equal pay and equal representation in levels of corporate governance. Joining us to discuss this new research is the CEO of the company that put it out. She is Diana van Maasdijk, CEO of Equileap. Diana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Maggie. Happy to be here.
So, Diana, every year for the past 8 years, Equileap has analyzed some of the largest companies in the world. This data set includes nearly 3,500 companies across 24 markets. There are $10 billion worth of investment products. So, you are looking at quite a large data set here. Can you take us through the top line findings when it comes to gender representation at some of these very large companies?
Yeah, sure, Maggie. So indeed, it's been the eighth year that we do this, and we look at all the companies with a market cap of 2 billion US dollars or more that are listed in 24 economies around the world. So these are definitely the big names and the companies that that we all recognize. When it comes to findings, I would say there's three main findings. First one is that the number of women in leadership positions are just not moving. For the third year in a row, we see that we have 7% female CEOs, only 7%. And we see that the percentage of the board and of the women in executives all go between 20, 30%, and they really aren't moving at all. If they're moving, it's a 1% here or there. So women in leadership is stagnating. Then the other finding that we also see is that there are some positive movements when it comes to the gender pay gap. There is much more transparency. Many more companies are publishing the gender pay gap. But why are they doing this? They're doing this because they're being forced to, because of legislation in many countries, particularly in Europe, Australia, Japan now has legislation to force companies to publish the pay gap. And we know that nothing changes if there's no transparency. So we know this is a good thing. But here again, it's being forced. And finally, in the largest economy in the world, in the United States, we're seeing regression when it comes to gender equality. We're seeing less companies publishing the gender pay gap, less companies having supplier diversity programs, and the number of women in leadership is here stagnating also.
Your data is really interesting because if you look at it alongside other reports that come out year over year, like the McKinsey Women in the Workplace report that they produce with Lean In, this is very consistent. Your data is showing about 38-40% representation of women just at all levels. And then as you get to higher levels of seniority, the representation of women goes down. I want to ask you about some of the companies that are doing it well. I have here the top 10 companies in the US. We're looking at folks like International Flavors and Fragrances Incorporated, Procter and Gamble, Boston Scientific, Bank of America. Diana, I won't put you on the spot about the actual gender makeup of each of these companies, but I'm wondering, the report calls out that the US continues to fall in the ranking. Only 7 US companies made the top 100 in 2026. What does that say to you? And what
Yeah.
do you think is the reason for this decline? Is there a single culprit?
I think it's a number of things, but indeed the decline is really clear. So this year, only 7 companies made it to the top 100 of the United States, 7 US companies. The year before that, it was 11. The year before that, it was 15. And the year before that, it was 17. So every year, we're seeing less US companies coming into the top 100. I don't think we can pinpoint to one thing, but it has to do with the what we are seeing right now, the importance that is being given from the government position, I think, towards what is gender equality and diversity. While in Europe, there's legislation coming from governments to enforce transparency, to enforce quotas. What we're seeing in the United States is that there's definitely no legislation promoting this, but at the same time, we do know that right now there's a government in the United States that does not see diversity and equality as an important issue. So unfortunately, this translates very clearly in how many companies are being transparent and how many companies are actually promoting gender equality.
I would call out just to support what you just said. The US ranks last among developed markets in transparency. And at the rate that you've analyzed, it would take the US to reach transparency standards that Europe achieved in 4 years. Let me redo that.
Yes.
Sorry. Let me just redo that. Just to support that point, I'm looking at some of the data right now, and according to your analysis, the US ranks last among developed markets in transparency around this data. And you find that it would take nearly 4 decades for the US to reach the transparency standards that Europe achieved in 4 years. But what's interesting, you talk about the government. And of course, we've seen from President Trump his desire to, quote, end DEI in America. He said that in the State of the Union at the end of February. But what I'm wondering is this decline predates his second term as president. You noted the levels in 2023, and for most of 2024, President Biden was the president of the United States. So is it that companies aren't hiring at enough rates of equality? Is it that folks are retiring from positions of power and women aren't being promoted to replace those? Have you looked at factors like that?
Women are just not being promoted. And the truth is that I believe they wouldn't be promoted at the same levels in Europe if there wasn't legislation that was forcing it. So I do think that even though we now have a government that is against DEI, there is a trend that was already happening that if you just leave it to the companies, if you really just leave it to the companies and hope that there will be gender balance, you see that that movement does not happen. A very clear example is France. France had a quota for women on boards as of 2011, I think 2011 or 2012. And they reached 40% of women on boards. Right now they have 44% women on boards in France. But one layer lower, women in the executive committees were not surpassing 30%. And so the French again said, well, we will wait and see what happens. And when the change didn't happen, they've now put legislation. And now there's legislation in France to force companies to the 30% and to 40% by 2030.
Another piece that's really interesting to me here is the dichotomy between executive leadership, CEO leadership versus board director levels. Now,
Yeah.
representation on corporate boards globally is not at parity, I should note. So what we're celebrating here is, or not even celebrating, highlighting is progress, but progress with an asterisk. But your data found that women account for roughly 33% of all board
Yes.
seats overall versus 7% of CEO seats.
Mhm.
Is this because of the legislation that you mentioned? Is this because there's just one CEO versus a board of directors can be 10, 12, etc.
Yeah.
people? Is it because there are some private initiatives? Like here in the States, we have networking initiatives to help get women on boards, to give the information and networking and access that will help them reach those positions of power. Is it all of the above?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. There has been quite some years, some decades now, of a movement of trying to get 30% women on boards. So we do indeed have reached now globally 33% women on boards. And in the United States, that's 32% for the publicly listed companies. And I think that this has to do with the fact that there has been definitely a movement of let's get women on boards, let's get women on boards. And so now we've gotten. But again, here the target was 30%, and that's what we've gotten. Still not parity because we should be seeing anything between 40 and 60% if we want to be talking about parity. So I think that when people want something and when they definitely make it very specific and they put targets, that's when we get there.
I want to move to the transparency aspect of this report. We've talked about it a little bit, but something that's very interesting to me is, and you called this out a little bit earlier, Asia Pacific has undergone a near complete reversal in their pay transparency. In 2021, 91% of companies in the region did not disclose gender pay data. By this year, over 80% publish it.
Yes.
That's a remarkable shift in just 4 years. What accounts for that?
Legislation again. A very specific country, Japan, had the lowest transparency on gender equality for many years in our rankings. There were hardly any Japanese companies publishing the gender pay gap. Then, about 2 years ago, the laws changed. Last year, it was enforced, and today, more than 90% of the Japanese companies publish their gender pay gap.
I guess my follow-up to that is it a bad thing that the laws are doing that? You've alluded a few times that it's legislation, legislation,
Yeah.
legislation. Does that put it at risk for rollback? And is it better when these sorts of initiatives come from a grassroots ground up effect? Or could long-term gains be achieved because of legislation?
I think it would be better if it would come up from the companies themselves, if they would do this because they saw the benefit of gender balance, the benefit when you have more equality within a corporation, the benefit when you're finding talent pool from two different groups, from both men and women, not just within the men. I think that would be great if it would be that. But the benefit of having gender equality, if it goes faster, then I think, and if we are realizing that it really is happening when someone puts a law, then I think that maybe even though it's not as nice to have, it is something it's beneficial. In the end, you do want corporations to get the best talent for both the female and the male pools. And so I think that that's really important to then put the legislation in place so that that happens quicker.
When we talk about the benefits of equal pay, equal representation, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I want to make it clear that we're not just talking about diversity for diversity's sake. There
Mhm.
are legitimate business advantages to be gained from having more women on boards in executive leadership. We at Forbes have found correlations between higher revenue, higher profit with the
Mhm.
companies that have better balance on those positions of power. But I'm wondering, Diana, in your research and analysis, what have you found that ties to maybe it's a data point, an analysis point? What supports the case for gender parity and diversity in corporate leadership?
Yeah, like you say, Maggie, we have also found the same correlations. We have built indices together with index makers, and whether they looked at the US market, at the French market, or at the emerging markets, but they always show us an outperformance of when you choose the companies that have higher gender equality. So we know that gender equality is not only a nice to have, but it's a great to have when it comes to the financial benefits of investing in equality.
Is there anything else that stands out at this report? We've talked a lot about the US. What stands out to you about Europe or other regions that you have analyzed here?
Well, what stands up about Europe is definitely that there's the EU tax transparency directive coming up this year, and that's going to enforce all companies to publish their gender pay gap. So, what we're seeing more at the European level is that you have um, that the EU has pretty much stopped waiting and that they're now putting these legislations in place. What I also think that stands out from this report is that the percentage to make it to the top 100 has increased, which shows you that the top 100 companies are really doing a great job. And those companies you mentioned in the United States, they're doing really a great job on gender equality. So we're really happy to be able to show that every year it's getting more and more difficult to get to the top 100. And the companies which stay with the same score as last year end up having a lower place in the ranking. So you really have to continue to work hard at gender equality in order to make it to the top 100.
That's really interesting. So the best are getting better. So I'll
Yes.
dig into some of the data. Procter and Gamble, which folks may know because of Puffs tissues or Bounty paper towels, they have a gender equity score of 75%. And that year over year change, you have a little red arrow down. So that means they had a higher gender equity score last year, but they're still in the top 10. What does it take to achieve a gender equity score of 75%? Is that the composition of the board plus executive management?
Well, we look at 19 criteria, different criteria. So we're looking at the gender balance at four levels within the company, at the board, at the executive level, at the senior management, and at the workforce. So if you have anything between 40 and 60%, you get the highest numbers. So it means having some form of gender balance at these four levels. It also means, what are you doing for the gender pay gap? Are you publishing it? Are you trying to close it? Do you have any strategies to address the gender pay gap? Do you give parental leave to both primary and secondary caregivers? And do you have policies in place, both in your supply chain and in your workforce, to promote diversity and equality? Now, so if you have all of these things and a little bit of everything, that's when you make it. The average score this year is around 44%. So then you can see that someone who has 75% is definitely going to be in the top 100.
What do you think the scores will do over the course of this year? You've been doing this research for 8 years now, or publishing it for 8 years. If you had to guess, will we see a collective drop between 2026 and 2027, given what we've seen in certain state and country governments, what we've seen with the trends overall? Or is there hope that the declines and stagnation that you talked about at the beginning will start to reverse?
I think we will continue to see the same trend with Europe and Asia continuing to improve, many times because of legislation, and the United States, which makes up half of the universe of companies that we research for this report. The United States will continue to decline. And so that is unfortunate. Then when you balance that out, we will see that we continue to see this stagnation.
Is there any call to action you would give to the Forbes audience, which includes entrepreneurs, CEOs, aspiring entrepreneurs, but a number of people who do have hiring power? What would you like them to know and or do in the coming year?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have hiring power, you have buying power, and you have investment power as a consumer. So I would say speak to your investment managers. Hey, are we investing in the companies that have more gender equality? Because that is available. There are investment funds in the United States where you can invest in the companies that have more gender equality. You can ask your investors. You can also look at the top 100 and decide who you want to buy from. And when you are working for the different companies, you can talk to your colleagues and be like, do we have targets in place? Are we ensuring that we find the right people, both who are men and women, to bring to our teams?
Diana von Maasdijk, thank you so much for joining us. This is such
Thank you.
important research. We appreciate you putting the time to bring it to the world, and thank you for talking to us about it today.
Thank you for inviting me.